aesthetic mark like Cultic, you know, whatever. I don't know. I'm not going to tell you. Make one better one up and you can have it. What? Fred. It's called Fred. Yes, Fred.
Good evening, everybody. Tonight's talk will be in English for any of you that would like translation and do not yet have a headset. Please do pick one up. Perhaps pick one up as well if you'd like to hear any French questions later in the translation, in the discussion translated into English as well. So I'm very happy to be able to introduce tonight Beth Povinelli, who has arrived today with 6 other members of the Caribbean Film Collective, who will be presenting their 2 most recent films tomorrow night, so please do come back then. And they're fresh from the London Film Festival. Beth tonight will be talking to the aesthetic mark and the wick of the Cultic, as you can see. She has been working in Northern Australian Indigenous communities since 1984. In that time, she came to create with a number of members of her extended family, the Caribbean Film Collective, in 2008, and her thought navigates, as she does regularly, between New York and Northern Australia. Her writing has focused on developing a critical theory of late liberalism that, as she said, would support an anthropology of the otherwise. This has really unfolded through this relationship with Indigenous communities, and she has written numerous books. Her most recent, Geontologies of her career into late liberalism, this year received the Lime on Trilling Book Award. And many of the Caribbean films have also received awards, including notably the 2015 Visible Award. I think without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Elizabeth, and there will be time for discussion later, so please do prepare your questions. Beth.
When I give a lecture sitting, I tend to race because I start falling asleep. So I'm hoping that this will keep me going at a nice pace so our fantastic translators can have time to unfold what I'm sure will be some very twisted set of thoughts. But let me start so that we can get to questions where I often find the real thoughts start happening rather than simply in this lecture. Oh, crap. It's the wrong lecture. I'm going to add it. Okay. I can do it. All right. Let's see if I can do this. So, there's no more tired question than what art is, what its essence is, what's an aesthetic judgment, what's an aesthetic value. There's no more tired question than aesthetic disinterest and aesthetic autonomy. We all know those days of the Kantian questions are done. Today we ask, what can art do? Right? And there's a sticky on the wall that asks just this question: what can art do? And we ask this because we know that the question of essence is no longer the kind of question that either critical theory or philosophy finds, why am I wearing glasses? I'm not reading. Finds essential. Instead of essence, of course, we ask about existence. What does something do? What does a concept do? And thus, when we ask about art, we ask, what can art do? There are a number of art collectives around this amazing show that ask exactly that use art to do something. There's no better theorist of what art can do than, say, our friend Boris Groys, who many of you might know, who, and I can't quote him because his words aren't in front of me, nevertheless asks and states, what is the, if we ask what is the essence of art, what does art do? We don't ask, we immediately are in the vicinity of asking questions about who controls identity, and this is Boris. Who controls identity? Me or the state? Who controls, and the question for him of who controls identity is a question about power. That is, who controls the categories of identity and thus the possibility of subjectivity and otherness. Thus, for Boris Groys, at the heart of art is the question of identity, insofar as representation and identity, and the question of power of control over that. So when we no longer ask what is art, what is the essence of art, how do I know when I'm seeing art, but rather we ask what can it do in that sense, that is, art as a political activity. Now, when we started asking that, like what can art do, and it's not just Boris Groys, but of course Boris Groys moving from, now I'm just going, when Boris Groys moving from a very long history, both in the West and in the non-West, and I'll talk about the non-West later. When Boris Groys asked that question, he was asking it in the context of a much broader critical and philosophical discussion that liberated art and the question of art and the question of power from art itself. So many people in this room will know that when we talk about art and power, art and truth, art, identity, who controls the formations of identity, we also begin to think about representation more broadly, both art and representation, art and power, power and knowledge, but also, of course, film, performance art, and etc. And even further, if you turn to someone like Michel Foucault, it's not simply art as an object, a film as an object, a performance as a temporal kind of object, perhaps, but rather art and aesthetics, and we can think about the relationship between them, as a more general problem of what he called esthesis. And here you'll no doubt know a quote that I'll refer to now since I can read it, from Foucault. And this was, in his later work, and Foucault here is moving from the Western avant-garde tradition. And he says, what strikes me is the fact that in our society, he's talking about, French Western society, so it has a limit, it has a geography.
Sorry, I can take this one?
Yeah, sure. You're welcome. Okay. Anyone else can any questions so far?
It's not like shy.
Which one is that?
I have a shy. He learns in the bed.
Yeah. No, it's fantastic. You should totally take it. I think. Can you take it? Who's in charge? Yes, okay. So you have Foucault, who says, and I quote, What strikes me is the fact that in our society, and again, it's a geography, this is going to be important. In our society, art has become something which is related only to objects and not to individuals or to life. That art is something which is specialized or which is done by experts who are artists. That art is something which can be specialized or which is done, but couldn't everyone's life become a work of art, he says? Why should the lamp, which, he's thinking of Duchamp, why should the lamp or the house be an art object but not our life? And here, for Foucault, the question that demanded answering was not, can there be art after the catastrophe or the multiple catastrophe, but how to think about aesthetics as a subcategory of ascesis. That is a subcategory of a practice of making ourselves something other than how we're governed. And here we see how it fits with Borsforth. Now, nobody, I doubt here, is so naive to think this revolt against classification, this revolt against the way in which power controls identity, figures us. The art as a revolt against that figuration, that classification, that control over identity, that control over discourse. No one's so naive to think that the revolt against classification necessarily resists commodification, or that the precepts and the truth functions of art necessarily need to be progressive. All right? So we know that the ready-made now often means ready-made for the market, or ready-made for maximal investment and profitability. We also know that care of the self can be manifested as the speculative accumulation and investment in art objects as a hedge against the coming environmental disaster. So this is a building that a super billionaire is building in Oklahoma, where he will store those art objects he hasn't sold off to build this after the coming anthropogenic climate and toxicity disaster. So he's going to live in here for the next, I don't know how many years with his art objects. Thus, we all know that in addition to the artist and the spectator, in art, in the struggle over power, is now the art, the artist, the spectator, and the speculator. And indeed, even building from someone like Benjamin, Walter Benjamin, the addition of the speculator, the addition of those who speculate on art, those for whom the ready-made for the market is made, is indeed one of the problems that art faces. As Adorno or Benjamin would say, as art moved, as art merged out of the cultic, it became grounded in the political, and thus one of the threats to art is that, and this is Benjamin, is that it returns to a new kind of cultic that is commodity fetishism. So just for those who, the cultic, what is the cultic? The cultic is a Western figure within a Western imaginary of people who had not or have not sufficiently detached the image from its material, they often say ritual context. People who supposedly, and again, this is a Western colonial imaginary, who still think the image does not represent, but acts on the world. And that is the theory of the fetish. So someone like Walter Benjamin says, first, to have art has to emerge from the cultic, become something that can be representation. Thus, against which we can have aesthetic judgment, etc. And one of the threats to art is that it moves from the political to a new kind of fetish, which is commodity fetishism. Okay. Now, one of the reasons that this new form of the ready-made, that is ready-made for the market, has sent shivers through, say, left critical art theory, left critical philosophy, left critical Western critical theory, is not this history that creates art by creating this imaginary cultic figure, right? So to have art, you have to, in the West, you say, art is the history, the result of the ability of people to become a different kind of people, to see images as simply representations. Now, it could also be Catholics as primitives, or Russian Orthodox as primitives. So the misunderstanding of an icon as a representation of something versus having a power that you can touch or rub on it, right? Now, the reason that the new form of ready-made that is ready for the market, ready for commodity fetishism, has sent shivers across some segments of the art world is that the truth function that Western philosophy and critical theory, and I'm talking about on the left, right, amongst us, the truth function that Western philosophy and left critical theorists have ascribed to art, that is, the problem with ready-made for the market, is that critical theory and philosophers say there's a truth function to art. And here I'm not talking about Kant and his theory of aesthetic judgment, in which, you know, you look at art and then this disinterested sensation of the purposiveness of the beautiful object spirals into a specific kind of universal judgment without content and all that. No, just chuck that, right? I mean, don't chuck it if you like it, keep it if you want, I don't care. I mean the way in which art and artists continue to function in the West's, and here it's a geography, in the West's self-account of its own world historic truth, and thus always opposed to somewhere else. That is, the West's self-account of its difference and its separation from other humans and their relation to images, imagistic practices, and etc. Deleuze and Badiou may not have agreed on much. Badiou might have wanted to drag Deleuze by his hair all over Paris. But they both singled out art as, on the one hand, a key mode of thought, that's Deleuze, and a set of truth procedures, that's Badiou. For instance, Deleuze and Guattari distinguish three modes of truth, three modes of thought. Philosophy is a mode of thought that produces concepts. Science is a mode of thought that produces function and reference, like grids through which experimental knowledge can unfold. And art as a mode of thought that produces percepts and affects. So there are only three, and there's philosophy, there's science, there's art for them. Badiou, who completely, different kind of mathematical grounding to his work, whatever, places art as one of his four truth procedures alongside science, love, and politics. So art has a special role in Western critical theory. It's fundamental to the Western account of its own difference. We're told again and again that for art to play these roles in Western truth and thought, to be one of three, one of four, art had to first liberate itself from this, and again, imaginary colonial image of the cultic, of those people who couldn't tell that the image wasn't where power actually was. It's only a representation of it. The celebrated freedom and autonomy of the artist, curator, and art were achieved, we are told, in lockstep with the broader, now notice, human struggle. So it's the human struggle for social freedom and autonomy. Art became possible, we're told, when the image was historically distanced from the cult, those who have cults, theology and tribalism, and it's threatened again if it becomes part of commodity fetishism. Thus, for there to be art, thus for there to be the aesthetic, or an aesthetic mark, something marked by the aesthetic, there has to be the governance of the cultish. Some people need to be figured as having misunderstood the image as not a representation, but the embodiment of a thing. Now, of course, this raises a set of questions that a number of collectives, a number of artists, a number of performance theater groups, film groups from the South, from indigenous communities and native communities have struggled with. That is, how do you make art if you yourself have been framed as the cultic? Do you make art? Do you want to make art? Or do you want to make something that is not art? Or do you want to make art to do something other than make yourself autonomous from the own material grounds of your life? And that's a little bit about what all I want to really do today is ask, like, what is it to be then an artist, an indigenous artist, a queer artist, an artist from the South, when from the West, art is possible only in relation to its other, and its denigrated other, the cultic. The way I'm going to move is pretty simple, even if it might get a little unduly thick. I'll try not to. But to start really by saying, okay, well, what are some of the what are different ways in which we can think about the aesthetic mark? That is something that marks the aesthetic, that is a mark on the aesthetic, that marks through the aesthetic, right? That deforms it, all of which is hopefully going to ramify in, like, what is art for, like, the Cosmopolis Film Collective. And the Cosmopolis Film Collective is about 30 people, all of whom, other than me, are Indigenous, from North Australia, from a small community of about 250 people. And I'll talk about more about how it emerged later as we move in there. But I'm going to talk first about, to try and answer the question of like, what is, say, art for the Cosmopolis Film Collective? Is it art that the Cosmopolis Film Collective are seeking to make? And how does the governance of this cultic, of this representation of certain people as having not being able to understand that the material is not the art, the image in the material is not the art, but a representation of something. Okay, so I'm going to start by just talking a little bit about the mark, an aesthetic mark, and it's hopefully it's going to move a little bit, and then hopefully you'll see how it all ramifies. Hopefully, okay. So there are many ways of talking about an aesthetic mark, something that marks the aesthetic. And it could be a mark of the aesthetic, it could be a mark on the aesthetic, it could be a mark across the aesthetic, it could be intentional or unavoidable blemish or scar. It could be the Derridian trace. Let's take the Derridian trace. A lot of people perhaps know that Derrida, coming from and distorting the structuralist tradition, understood language or logos to drive toward totalization, Right? So he thought, oh, language drives toward totalization. Thus, he was interested in this idea of the mark or the trace, and other two that drive toward totalization. It is the necessary absence that opens the structure necessarily. Thus, like Adorno, we might say, the trace or the dialectics of art provide a indwelling politics insofar as this trace or that dialectics always keeps art open to its otherwise, right? It's always, it can't close, it's always open, it's always tending toward, it's unable to seal itself. But what if the language or the dialectic wasn't working, the trace wasn't working against the tendency of logos or art or the image or any kind of this, and I'm going to get a little bit this thing here, let's just broaden it out from art, but rather, in order to have a this, a something, a piece of art, a film, a performance, etc., there has to be a constant way of creating this here, now, and thus what anything tends toward is not closure and totalitarianism, totalization, but rather what everything tends toward is a certain kind of disintegration, a certain kind of straining, an interior straining that is constantly pulling it apart. Thus, this wall behind you and the images on it, we could point to it and there's a wall, right? And there are images, and there they are. And you move from one to the other, and you can go behind the wall or in front of the wall. But in fact, of course, and I think we know this at this point, is that wall and those images are there only insofar as what they're made out of and how they're maintained, but mostly how they're maintained keep it there, right? So it's always falling down. It's always crumbling. It's always blurring. It's always fading. And one of the things that a lot of interesting critical art does is not presuppose what we would call the frame, but here I would call the embankment of an art, piece of art, a performance, but anything, read more broadly, but rather put the emphasis on the embankment, otherwise known as the frame itself. So that in order to have, and this is the first thing, in order to have art, you have to have some kind of embankment, which you would call a frame, right? And a lot of artworks now put a lot of pressure on exactly those embankments, the embankments of the aesthetic object rather than the object itself. They put weight on the irreducible traces, remainders, and imprints of artworks rather than the artwork itself. And here we can think of Ladi John Dill, Sondong, Big Van der Pol, Terror Shinoda, but also in relation to the, here's our friend the Cultic, sorry. Benjamin. Here's the embankment. Okay. But also the Cotterman Film Collective has put a lot of pressure on not the artwork, sure, but the question of how certain things are kept in place and how they're pulled out of place. So for instance, that's this log pile, and it was created out of just one of those plates that goods and materials are moved on, like in trucks and stuff, you know, those wooden things. I don't know how you're going to translate that. And then on that were stacked all the laws that have pertained to their lives, both in terms of you know, how the state recognizes whether they're legitimate or illegitimate subjects, how they can use their land or not, fencing laws, gun laws, everything, all the laws that constitute certain kind of fences that are forms of embankment. And then we made a wire mesh, mangrove lakes, and streams. And so it's an object, but the focus was meant to be on how day after day, various forms of debris accumulate in that wire mesh. As people smoke, they drop tickets, whoever's responsible for sweeping up the room accidentally sweeps into there. So the idea was not to look at the art object, but rather to think about the way in which all things, including art, but lives, bodies, this table, those walls, your skin, aren't there, but are the results of someone putting investment, someone putting labor in, someone taking investments from somewhere else, someone sucking labor from somewhere else to keep a thing in place, whether it's an art object or your skin. So your skin, in certain conditions, will have just erupt in sores if you're living in a certain place. So if you're going to have this kind of skin to embank yourself so that you can be something, then where does that labor of embankment come from? And the art object is meant to do that. It's like, in order for them to have their mangroves, their creeks, their land, the question is, from where do the forces of the embankment, the holding in place, come from? Right? Taken from somewhere and going somewhere else. So we can say that everything, including art objects, is the result of an embankment, the result of something that keeps something at least in place for a little while. Your lungs, your skin, a wire mesh, a creek. What keeps it in place? What pulls it out of place? Who benefits from that pulling? And thus every embankment, whether art or river or performance or human, every embankment is an effort of attention in the sense that someone must maintain it or manipulate it, must keep in place previous embankments and the energy that took to keep those in place, or must pull it apart. And here again, in that piece of art here, the referent, if we put it there, the referent is the way in which mining companies attempt to pull the embankment of rivers out, to literally bust the skin of a river in order to extract various forms of minerals for mining wealth. Now, so that on the one hand, like the emphasis now is, again, in larger groups, on the forces of embankment. But of course there are other, and this is just part of it. It was that kind of messiness and then in relation to this kind of pristine mapping. But there are other kinds of marks that I think start moving our attention away from the embankment, looking at either the thing in the embankment or the embankment. That can be seen if we start looking at the mark on an aesthetic object. Now, why this image? I'm not sure if anyone's seen this, but this is Plan 9 from Outer Space. Do you know Plan 9 from Outer Space? Yes. I love Plan 9 from Outer Space. Plan 9 from Outer Space is one of the first of the not even B movie maker, but C or D movie maker, Ed Wood. Do you know Ed Wood? Yeah, love Ed Wood. Oh, and just as an aside, Ed Wood went from making like these science fiction, these super bad science fiction movies, to making these kind of like, I don't even know what to call them. They're these amazing grindhouse films. Like there's one called Orgy of the Dead. There's another one called Necromania, and they're just as badly produced as Plan 9 from Outer Space. Why Plan 9 from Outer Space? Plan 9 from Outer Space is famous for its bloopers. Like there's a scene where these zombies, I guess from outer space, they bite you. I forget what happens, to be honest, but let's say they bite you. And they bite you and then you become a zombie. So the zombies are chasing some non-zombies through a graveyard. And you see these tombstones, right? And they look very solid, but one of the actors accidentally hits the one tombstone and it just kind of falls down. You see it's just cardboard. And then the spaceship, you can see the string, and someone's done a whole dissertation that looks at all the bloopers in Planet 9 from Outer Space. So why Planet 9 from Outer Space? Because, at least in relation to the Cosmopolis Film Collective, it's not simply that they're putting pressure on the question of who keeps. It's not what is a river, what is art, what is an art object, what is a human, right? It's rather from where do the forces of maintaining certain kinds of arrangements, rivers, certain kinds of humans, certain kinds of art objects, right? And we can think about people who just make decisions about what art materials are collected, kept in restoration, etc. But the collective also has a huge number of you could say blemishes on there. Like this is not about, this is just like consistency in pants. This is one day in a film in which everyone's wearing like 4 different pairs of pants. And you know, on one hand, we could say, well, that's someone should just pay attention to what pants we're wearing. But you know, these shots are over the course of maybe months and months, although that's the way we produce our films. But these marks, we could read these marks. No one intends to produce what we could call inconsistencies in these films. Like no one means to have different hair, although like Gavin, who you'll see tomorrow night, often has 3 different hairstyles in any one movie, even though the action is happening over the course of a day or 2. No one means to do this, but these what we might call inconsistencies are actually scratches on the surface of the films caused by the social worlds in which members live. That is, these inconsistencies in pants, they're often, if you just know where the people are and you just pay attention to the landscape, in the same, literally the same scene of action, there are 4 different kind of places. They're supposed to be in the same place, right? Those aesthetic scratches or marks are themselves the sign, the mark of the kind of world in which Indigenous people live and are forced to live today. So, interruptions by police, the ravages of poverty, displacements from land closed that was once open, land mined that the day before it wasn't mined but no one knew, all of which create on the surface of the image a set of what might be called disfigurations, but also could be called registers of a certain stubborn willfulness within the Cosmopolis to shoot, no matter that the conditions of their life make errant a certain kind of aesthetic smoothness. That is, that those disparities of clothes, of landscapes, of hair, of even bodies, if someone suddenly is in jail and someone else takes over their role, are all the Cosmopolis saying, we will nevertheless continue to make the film because that the inconsistencies, although everyone tries not to have them, these inconsistencies are themselves a register of the lives in which they live. Right? So there are references within the films to police disruptions, to incarcerations, to racism, to toxicity, to impoverishment. They're references, but they see these marks as registers of that life world. Now note that slowly I've moved, hopefully, from the object, right, which, for Cotterbean at least, is necessarily not a question of aesthetic judgment, but a question of embankment. Who is going to put the effort and energy into keeping what kinds of worlds in place? From where does that energy come? To the question of the worlds that mark the objects themselves, right? That scratch the surfaces of them. And here it might seem that we're moving now into the world of the Cotterbean and out of the world of the art object. So it's as if we're saying there's the art object and there's the Cotterbean world. But in fact, when we turn back to the original question, and here's where we're going to move, that is, what is it to make objects if you are the people that art says it detached from? Right? If you are the cultic people, what is it to make art? Right? Are the Cotterbean seeking to make art? And they're going to be here, more of us are going to be here tomorrow night, so you can also ask that. Are the Cotterbean trying to make art? Are they trying to make films? Right? Are they trying to make representation? And let's say, on the one hand, yes, fine. Now let's get rid of that. Yes, fine. To understand what the Cotterbean are trying to make, perhaps use art and film to make, one has to return to the question of the cultic and return to the question of the cultic in their particular social world. And here, I'm going to back up and just give a very short history of the colonial world in which they and really their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents lived. And thus begin to unpack how this cultic governs their lives prior to art's arrival, or the arrival of them as artists. Things to know, for instance. It was only it was rather up in the north of Australia, the literal colonization of the north. I mean, all sorts of effects had happened because the south of Australia was colonized. The first settlements were 1788. The north, the first white settlements, although there are all kinds of effects of colonialization before that, wasn't until 1864. And in 1864, colonialism was still, in Australia, grounded on this notion of terra nullius, empty land. Now, again, as many people have noted, it wasn't that, Europeans were so blind they didn't see other people. Okay. They're pretty blind, but not that blind. They weren't that blind. Rather, terra nullius meant that though there were people there were not people who had sufficiently detached themselves from what art theory would call the cultic, right? They still were organized, according to Western discourse, by this idea of the fetish. That is, land as shaped, as having a shape that governed them through the dreaming. So the dreaming, we'll talk about it more tomorrow, like the dreaming as sites on the land from which they had descended, and images of those sites that held power. Right? So they hadn't, in the Europeans, argued. It's just a way of stealing people's country, but had to justify it, I suppose, to themselves or in some way. So they argued that, they hadn't sufficiently evolved a form of society or politics that gave them in which they understood property rights. And a critical component of this was a theory of the cultic object or the fetish. From 1864 through 1967, in the North, Indigenous people were wards of the state, where they weren't explicitly shot. Right? There was an attempt to breed them out of existence. So one drop of white blood meant the state could come in, grab your kids, and turn them in places, and with the theory that they would just keep whitening people up until there were no indigenous people anymore. There are people who were considered tribal, were kept in camps. Every aspect of their lives were regulated, where they worked, who they married, etc. And it wasn't until 1967 that Australia had a referendum in which the voting population, which was by and large a settler population, was given a choice, a yes or no choice, around two questions. One, should states and territories be forced to count their indigenous subjects? So up to then, it was totally terra nullius in the sense of governance. Like, a state didn't even have to know how many indigenous people were there because there was no law that forced them to count them. And most states and territories didn't count their indigenous population. They were totally made invisible in the record. And two, the voting population in Australia, which was again mainly settlers and white, were asked whether or not the federal government could write special laws for indigenous people in the country. And this initially was seen as a very progressive power, because places like the Northern Territory, Queensland, and many places in the center and west of Australia had very conservative governments. And so the idea was that the federal government, it was a Labor government, the federal Labor government would write progressive land rights laws for indigenous people in the north. And indeed, in 1975, and note how, like yesterday, this is 1975, Labor government was writing a piece of legislation that would allow indigenous men and women, indigenous families to claim land that was obviously already theirs on the basis of anything, on the basis of having been displaced by colonial processes, they were living there for a long time, or descent from a totemic source, or anywhere. So it's really open. And this, amongst a number of other things, provoked such a crisis that government was sacked. It was the one time the Queen was pulled in, because there's still a Queen, pulled in, and the Queen's representative sacked the Labor government. Then the Conservative government came in and said, okay, still you can have land rights, but it has to be very narrow. And this was a way of appeasing the mining companies. Okay, so the very narrow way, oops. Oh, this is just saying that in the films we also refer to white people, the state throughout, right? So there's references to the disruption of their lives in the films, and then there are registers of it. This was basically the reduction of a very rich, ongoing, surviving understanding of the deep entanglement of people and country materially in each other, and the complex and subtle ways in which different people, different groups worked to keep themselves and their countries in place. Because it wasn't as if, and we can again talk more tomorrow, as if you just sit there and do nothing. It's like working to keep a mutuality in place. But the state reduced it to who were you born from, right? Okay. Now, so in you could say in 76, the conservatives still, a lot of people thought progressive law had happened. And what everyone was celebrating from 1976 to 2007 was the Cultic. That is, there was this moment in Australia in which white Australians, settler Australians, celebrated the fact that indigenous people believed that the land in its form and certain kinds of image productions of that land in its form had power, was in a lot of parlance at the time spiritual, was animating, had a force about it. It wasn't just a representation, it was in the material itself. It was like powerful and resonating. And so Australia, is predominantly now a settler population, made its uniqueness and its difference. Aren't we special? Because we are in a continent of people who originally believe in this power of the cultic. And there's a lot of discussion about, say, indigenous painters and et cetera, about how certain things are just representations, but the truest art, not art, was not the things that could be shown, but the things that couldn't be shown. Right? So it's really a celebration of the cultic. But what can be positive in the governance of the cultic, representing people as other, right, can also become negative again. And it was in 2007 when it was decided by a conservative state that what was holding indigenous people back, what was causing low education rates, life expectancies in the 50s if you're a man, and in the 60s if you're a woman, diseases that should have been eradicated a long time ago, overcrowding, et cetera, violence, drug abuse, and et cetera, was not state racism and dispossession, was not mining and the way in which royalties from mining are passed out that can really only be used for like one-off kind of purchases and then leaves you in poverty again. But no, that wasn't what's causing these problems. What was causing these problems was the cultic. That people had been encouraging indigenous people to remain believing that their land and its images had power, and not understanding that it was just symbolic and a relationship. And so in 2007, and again, in relation to mining pressure, which wanted to open up the very lands that indigenous people had won under the good cultic, the government switched to a very loud campaign about the bad cultic under the excuse of a sex panic. And I can talk about it more, but in 2007, a report was published in the Northern Territory saying that in some remote communities, which in Australia is considered where, true indigenous people, like traditional people still live, that there were some instances of the sexual abuse of children. There was no documentation of such abuse. There was no contact, and there was in some places some. There was no comparison to how many white people abused their kids. There was no discussion of who was abusing his kids, which a lot of times are people, non-indigenous people working on the community. But the federal government, a very conservative government, said what's causing abuse is traditional Aboriginal culture. Their inability to understand the difference between, land as just inert and symbols and humans, right? And they under this piece of legislation passed in 2007, sent in the military. They changed land rights laws. They changed welfare laws, and etc. And it was in the context of this switch of the cultic, from good cultic to bad cultic, from good tribal to bad. And remember, before the good, there had been the bad. So bad, good, bad, and there will be a good again, then there will be a bad again, right? It's in the midst of this that about 30 people who are now part of Cultic Film Collective left their community, where the good cultic had produced divisions within the community because it carved it up on the basis of this imaginary of the traditional here, evaporated the more complex forms of attachment to land, and divided the community and created a riot. And so they left, and they made themselves homeless. And becoming homeless is not something that's anywhere. Everywhere it makes radical precarity, and in their context it absolutely made this head. It was in that context of homelessness that a group of people, and we were all sitting around, and we can give more of an explanation of how exactly later, came up with the idea of, first the idea was to use GPS, GIS-based media to use GPS, GIS enhanced, that they could use as a tourism. Go to here, and when you get there, it'll ding a satellite, and then the media will show up, and the idea was the media would be something like, you are standing on someone else's country. What are you doing here? So it'd have a certain kind of political relation to it. A lot of reasons about money, and again about embankment, but that didn't happen. And it was in that context that one of the members said, let's start making films that, on the one hand, would show what the kind of governing conditions we're in, but more importantly, would give everyone something that would act as an embankment to the group. And here we turn all the way around, and we say, what does art and film do? What does art do? Not what art is, what does art do? We would say that was fundamental to the Cultic collective. What art did, what art does, what art do in the context of their lives is two things. One, it provides a form of embankment, a practice within which a group of people can hold themselves together and find themselves to be something. Two, it intends, and so far working a little bit, intends to redirect the forces and energies that had been pulling apart not only themselves or communities, but their country, say mining. Take those forces and energies and redirect them toward maintaining that embankment here through the people, but also by taking any money made and putting it not back into making films, because I can talk about that money just comes from me, but into making outstations, resisting mining pressures to mine by giving people money to live through, right? But finally, to do non-art, that is, to make art in film in order to support and embank what is and is not the cultic. That is, to make a support, to redirect energies, to hold their land in place, to make the image powerful, to make images no different than the people in them and the place in which they're intended to enhance. And thus we could say that the Cultic Film Collective, although again, they will be here tomorrow, are on the one hand, those people who were not people in a theory of art because they had not separated representation from the power of the actual image itself. And they do not seek to make art in the sense of making an image that can be so separated, but to rather deform art, to make art pull art back into their, and I will say, not cultishness. Thank you.
That was fantastic. I think, I know we had a reading group beforehand, and a lot of people who participated in the reading group had more questions. So if some of those people would like to speak up, or anyone at all who has a question at this stage. Yes.
Yeah, I had a question that I'm carrying from the reading group, but I also works with this in a way. So So in your book, you talk about the epidermal point of view.
Yeah.
To talk about the subject, to talk about the body, to talk about organisms. And then here you talk about embankments.
Yeah.
To talk about what holds everything together. And then, not everything, each thing as a thing in order for it to be a thing. And then at some point, I think in your interview, maybe even in your book, you talk about the fact that it can't be anything else but a fiction.
Yeah.
So, could you?
That's
I find that very interesting, though. So.
Yeah, that's right. I think I can slide from the talk to that. Let me try. And if I slide too far away, just push me back. And so, and I'll start with the talk and then slide to the embankment epidermal. And again, this is, I'm trying to really poke at that part of critical theory that some on the left are still, the Frankfurt School. Right? I'm trying to say, look, yeah, sure, against commodity fetishism, against capitalism, right? But what does that against commodity fetishism rely on? And that's still relies on this colonial fantasy of people sunk in something, right? That haven't liberated themselves into freedom and autonomy and individuality and all that. I'm not saying that doesn't mean that, Cotterbeing and everybody else already had freedom and autonomy and individuality, right? It's not, the revelation is, oh, you're already like us. How did we mistake that, right? Because that doesn't do anything to the West. It just expands the West's own self-account into other spaces. So there's a double movement that a lot of people are trying to work with to respond to this moment, and that double movement is to say things are not autonomous or disinterested, right? To keep I wish like Rex was here or somebody was here, but to keep I will use an example, to keep Chunganena, which is a creek, in place, which was formed by this young girl who walked and laid down there, and it looks like that girl now because she laid down there. To keep it in place is to keep them in place, insofar as their form and its form are mutually entwined. And here we could say, to keep a certain kind of body in place here, my body in place, I need various kinds of, high blood pressure medicine. And thus that blood pressure medicine and my body are not two different things, but mutually entwined with each other, right? So the fiction is that there is this body here and that world out here, when in fact, the condition of my body is that I breathe in and out the world. So there isn't this body here and that body out there. There isn't a river, right? A bank, a person. There is a mutual set of material relations that embank each other. And by an embankment, what are we saying in French? Yeah. An embankment is like an epidermal skin. It's like an embankment is a skin, right? This skin is simply an embankment that certain processes go on out here. But this embankment, this epidermal embankment, is as open and to the outside as it is to the inside, right? So it has to be maintained. It's simple. It has to be maintained. So, in certain places, the conditions of poverty mean that this kind of embankment is not maintained, and people have sores, ulcers, all kinds of things. In Peru, where there's been, this ravaging of copper mining, the embankment that skin is, and the world in which the skin is such that, the skin literally extrudes copper now. So the copper is in and extruding on the body. So rather than thinking that there is a this or a that or here or there, there's only this-ish and there-ish and here-ish, right? And there's only questions of efforts of keeping certain kinds of things in place or redirecting energies to put other things in place. Think Detroit and Flint, Michigan, and lead, right? Resources pulled somewhere else. Think about whether or not Jean Roche's films are maintained or Nigerian farms are maintained, right? Where do the resources go to embank worlds and keep them in a certain kind of form or not? That's all, and thus the law pile, and not only law pile, but a lot of works that work with like the edges of things and the detritus that leak into things and the question of who maintains and keeps an order of things are not about the art objects, but about that epidermal maintenance. Yeah. Thus, art for the Kata being is a skin.
Thank you very much for the lecture. I have just a quite pragmatic question, because your lecture was very much residing on this notion brought by Benjamin in a very specific context as well, between the difference between an art designed for the cult and an art designed for the political. And then when we move to the context in Australia where you're reusing this notion of the cult, I just wanted to know, do you have an idea of the precise term which was used to describe this condition of these, by the colonizer, of these people who were being colonized? Because I guess that they were not using Benjamin's kind of terminology and distinction.
No, of course they weren't. No, it's not like, I'm not saying, look, Benjamin.
No, of course, it's just as it popped to my mind.
Fetish. Sometimes fetish. A lot of the early pre-modern ethnographers started using a Arunta word for this what Benjamin and others would call the kind of cultic ritual, which is Turinga. Yeah. And that became a kind of the common term for all of them. Yeah. The people would say a Turinga, which is an object that doesn't, in being designed, is the thing. Yeah.
Because what's quite interesting is that, well, of course, when Benjamin is writing that text, there's not always, there was already, in other parts of Europe, this kind of move toward the market, if you think of the Netherlands. But it's just like, I can totally see your point about the fetishization, which is, maybe characterizing in a very vast sense the move toward the arts since then. But all of the, would you say that it's a satisfactory, knowing that there is this whole notion of maybe spirituality which is removed from it, how satisfactory do you think that this conceptual tool that you're using, this distinction that he's doing between this move from the religious to the political is efficient in
No, I'm saying it's, just to be clear, it's a critique of that.
I know.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So say the question again?
No, so my question pretty much is like, how, if you push that to a step further, how does that, knowing that this distinction is already very rudimentary and already inaccurate in the time when he's writing it, when you take it to this, you know, when you teleport that to that context, you teleport it to a very specific, you know, ethnographic context, and so I'm just trying to know a bit more about that. That's very interesting, this kind of conceptual transfer that you were.
Yeah, I guess no, it's a great question. And these are preliminary thoughts. So one of the questions, like Karen Swalt, a lot of people have asked, is like, what happens when unpeopled people who have been unpeopled make art, right? Does something happen to the people? Does something happen to the art, right? That's a very interesting question. If you what I'm trying to do is if you then take that question, what happens, did something happen to people, does something happen to art? And you're asking not what art is, but what art does, then I think, and again, there's a number of people in this room, I think, who are thinking this through, then it's weird. It's like you're not asking either one of them. You're saying, what does art do? Whatever art's, I can't, it's so twisty. Maybe my twisted brain, but what you're making isn't art, because art was made this way. And thus what it is doing is something other than art, right? And is it simply the political, if the political is already saturated, or is it twisting somewhere else? And again, if we sit and talk with God, it's kind of twisting. So it's like it's twisting back into not that, of course. It's neither not art, or it's neither the cultic nor the not cultic. It's saying, yes, actually we do believe that the way in which this is produced, what it's meant to embank, is not art or the people, but the relationship between a deeper figuration of an entanglement. So it's kind of like what you said, but it's errant to it, because we refuse the difference of you. So the West that made itself different, right, we refuse that. So we don't want your category, right? But we also refuse the way in which you represented the difference between your category and what we do. And I think that's a struggle a lot of Native artists from the South, I think, are struggling with. How do you do it and say, no, it's not yours, and we're not you. We're not simply autonomous, disinterested, representative people like that. But it's not what you thought we were either. That is, it's neither one of those. We refuse the division itself. What language for that? There are a lot of languages people have, but that language is not going to. It refuses that category. We don't want to become people if becoming people demands that political. Yeah, something like that. Is that clearish?
Yeah, very much. There's a contingent of
If there's somebody else, I'll give priority. Okay.
No, there's someone. Oh, yeah, there's behind.
Hello, I have thank you for the talk, and I have a question a bit far away from the topic, but I wonder if I sometimes have a hard time distinguishing the mails or the chat I have on my computer being from a robot or a human. Is it being cultic or?
A little deaf. Human
sometimes,
yeah.
if I can't say if it's a robot or human,
a robot or a human, right?
who is speaking to me by mail or by chat,
yeah.
Would you say it's cultic, or it's really something completely different from what the relation of people from Australia have to mountains or rivers or.
I love that question because it's just like, no, it's a great question. I think the way I would answer it is the way I would answer it, and coming out of the kinds of things that I've been writing and thinking about and thinking with, is that the, you know, with the robot or artificial intelligence or Siri or, you know, all these, is this somewhat what, yeah. There's that I don't know which I'm talking to. Like, hello, when you get on the phone, hello, but are you human? Yes, I'm human. You think, no, you're not. You just, you know. So that kind of is this wonderful disembanking of not only the human, but the human as that which had been essential to whole sorts of governance and discourses. Okay. Which then I would say will lead to other embankments, etc. But the point I want to underline is that embanking or disembanking, neither embanking nor disembanking are in themselves left or right kind of activities. Right? So you could disembank the human and re-embank forms of, what we could call them forms of address. And now we're in an addressivity community. Some robots, some this one, some mixed, whatever. And that would be a new kind of identity in the sense of that struggle over identity. But it primarily benefits these increasing monopolies over semio-capitalism. So it's a new kind of embankment that I myself might not be working with, but would be working against. It could also, if I don't know if you were doing it a different way, could be an embankment that was working against semio-capitalism. So the proof is in how it distributes, how it forms and distributes forces and potentials across the network. So if it's allowing like these new global monopolies of semio-capitalism to suck more resources out of, say, my friends in Australia, then that kind of embankment I'm going to work to like try and like, you know, push a hole into. If it's working in a way that redirects power, then I might work for it. So I guess that's the way I would say. But yeah, in some ways it's a disembankment. But what is that re-embankment how is it gonna organize flows of value, life, materiality, etc.? I think that's how it is. I haven't thought about it.
So going back to what you were saying about art and this difficult problem you were trying to phrase, I mean, we've seen that can be asked about the word critique as well, as in a lot of critical theory, in the work of Foucault, and there's still a narrative that unpeople some people to do critique. So just if you could comment as on how do you place your work, and since you're doing critique, again, but you know, how do you think that problem in the problem doing critique?
In the book, and if this becomes something other than like I don't know, a chat here, but definitely in the last book, chapter after chapter after chapter says, if it is true that, and there, geontology, here we might say, you know, freedom and autonomy, art, whatever, is itself internally marked by this distribution of peopledness, or distribution of inert things and potentiality things. And if that really saturates critique, then no none of these critics are the exit. And here we can think of de Silva, whose critique of humanist exits to global racism. Like, if the human really is saturated by a racial discourse, it is saturated by, is that where the hook is? It's saturated by the distribution
Mesdames et messieurs,
use.
il est 20h30. Nous vous rappelons que le musée ainsi que les expositions seront fermés à 21h. Dès 20h50, nous vous inviterons à bien vouloir regagner la sortie. Merci.
So quickly, since we're firming up, if that concept is really, like, not accidentally, but in its heart, in its genealogy, saturated by that, why do we look at it? Why do we look to be included in it? And thus, really, and again, this talk with Benjamin a little bit to kind of shake at him, but in the book, Foucault, Deleuze, and again, I always say, like, these are people I'm loosely, you know, I would, like, if I had to do allegiances, I would say I'm in allegiance with these people. I'm in allegiance with Foucault and Deleuze and Benjamin and all. But that doesn't mean that no. Yeah, no. So, you know, it's doing critique. Yeah, sure, doing critique, but how do we? You could just say, and I think it's legitimate, saying, I'm just going to walk away from these motherfuckers. We're not being. We are being. Oh well, it doesn't matter. I mean, I've sworn so many times. I don't know why I pretend every time I'm shocked that it comes out of my mouth. But anyways, you can just walk away from them, and I think that's fine. But I think that's good. But they remain, you know, that touchstone so much that, like, if all I do is, like, make it harder for them, for this to be a touchstone from someone who, you know, then that's what I will do. That's how I will contribute a little bit of energy to disembanking, right? And disembanking without, you know, disembanking saying, look, a lot of us want to hold and think, like Juan said, want to think, well, an exit to this problem right now would be to distribute logos to everything. No, because you're just keeping what keeps you in place and just universalizing it. So no. Pull apart logos. You've got to be unskinned. You don't get to keep your skin. That's not going to be the exit. So that's critique. Okay, goodbye. Thank you, I mean. Very, very much.
Actually, we can continue another quarter now. That was the first announcement.
Oh, so sorry.
And we did have someone else with another question. So
oh yeah, no, I'm happy. I'll go all night. That's the thing. Yeah.
Hi, thanks very much for the talk. It's fantastic. And apropos the slide that we're actually looking at, could you just explain a little bit about the creation of the Caribbean in relation to what we're seeing up on the screen, in relation to clanism, and what the Caribbean actually is? I'm not sure if it's correct reading. This is where a little bit of knowledge might be dangerous, but is it the point that the Caribbean are not clan,
right,
and are a cross clan,
right,
that makes them so different and special?
Well, yes, and I'm going to have to pull it out a little bit. And again, tomorrow there will be more discussion of this. It's that two things. That when the actual land rights law was passed, that is, the first one wasn't passed because the government was sacked, and this one was passed. This was seen as a way of providing. Well, it was seen as an anthropological truth, so they just said this was true. But what the Cultic members see this is as a way of dividing people and separating countries, right? So in the Western imaginary, that apical, that top thing, would go right back into, say, let's say this is like Rex's dreaming is barramundi, which is kind of fish.